Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I think one of the major black dots we have managed, or black holes we have, is to properly understand Iran and to properly understand both the strengths and weaknesses from an Iranian perspective themselves. Now, Iran's main strategic assessment can be put simply in the formula 4+3, 4 ideological elements and 3 regions. Now, these 4 ideological elements are all in all contradictory. We have on the conservative side of the ideology pure Iranian nationalism, often underpinned with Arianism, and the traditional Shiaism. That's the Iran, the traditional, it was very common under the Shah. This is, Arabs know best this kind of Iran. The second one is, the second set is revolutionary. First and foremost, political Islam in the interpretation of Khomeini, and this is important. Here a contradiction is taking place, although the Velayat-e-Faqih is a Shiite concept. In foreign policy, it is thought to be non-sectarian. So that's, here again, the ambition is there, the concept might be wrong, but this is how they see it themselves. It's of course absurd for Sunnis to follow a Velayat-e-Faqih, but there's a logic behind to see it really in a pan-Islamic mode and to downplay Shiaism. And then we have something which is coming from the radical political Marxist left, not only the European left, but especially the anti-imperialist left, the Ben Barkas, a little bit Nasser, not Nasser is too much a nationalist, but third world socialism, Che Guevara plays a role. The whole political language, the whole formulation, how Iran talks about the US is colored in terminology borrowed by the radical left of a bygone era. These 4 elements Iran uses always either to justify policy A or policy B. So when people are puzzled what the Iranians are doing now, they can always hand to you somebody who is a poor Iranian nationalist, and on another day someone comes who is an Islamist and dreams of a huge alliance with all Sunnis and to go for a global revolution, kicking out the West. How the Iranians use these ideological elements very pragmatically, and they apply to 3 regions. The first region is everything which is around the borders of Iran. Here the Iranians know very well. They know their neighbors, they know the tribes, they know everything. Whether they implement the right policies is another question, but this is traditional a nation-state approach, a country which is concerned about national sovereignty, underpinned with nationalism. The third one is the global sphere. This is about the US and the global imperialism. That must be gone. Not many in Iran believe this still, but it is important. It's important from another perspective, namely because Iran has signed a serious an understanding of international relations, which is based on what Europeans have called the third world. So it's the Bandung spirit, it's the supporting the IAEA, and so on. And these play together, but the core region is the Middle East. The Middle East defined from an Iranian perspective running from the Gulf to the Levant. And from an Iranian perspective, you can combine this, because there's one point everybody should follow as a Muslim, especially after the long war with Iraq was over, and that is the Palestinian struggle. You support Palestine, or at least you say you support them. You put together Hezbollah, a Shiite militia from Lebanon, with Palestinian and other groups, and you create an alliance which ultimately is directed against Israel. What is this alliance about? Basically, it is very, very pragmatic, because the interests of Syria until the breakdown of the country, the interests of Iraq as a nation state, the interests of Hezbollah and of Hamas were simply diverse. Iran had called this system, which was a contradiction in itself, but a very well-maintained contradiction. The Iranians don't go for the perfect solution, they go for the manageable solution. That's a very important difference. There's no great vision. But they called it a vision, and this vision was called Mehwar Muqawemat, the resistance axis. This resistance axis had its heyday in about 2006 when Hezbollah pushed back an Israeli attack. Iran was en vogue everywhere. Ahmadinejad was a hero of the streets. But behind this axis of resistance, and if you were listening carefully, Iranian propaganda, depending on what they're just allowing to write, you can understand that the actual aim of this axis of resistance was not the support of the Palestinians. It was the outmaneuvering of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia being a competitor, and it's an old competition. Even when Saudi Arabia and Iran were both in the Western camp, Saudi Arabia always refused imperial Iran's leadership role or acclaimed leadership role for the Gulf and for the whole Muslim community. So this is an old competition, a manageable competition, but a competition that doesn't go away, which of course was aggravated by sectarianism. And here we come to another point. Most people view that all the Shiites are following blindly Tehran. There's a problem in this approach. First, the reality of Qom, if you look at the high amount of police and of security and of controlling of ayatollahs and listening into their telephones and so on, you understand that the relationship between the traditional Shiite clergy and the Islamic Republic of Iran is not that cozy and not that easygoing. Even more complicated it gets with Najaf, and even more complicated it did get until 2012 with Damascus, because in Damascus, Taqlid, a group of Marjaya, of outspoken anti-Iranian clerics, who were or anti-Khamenei clerics, were placed there. That was the Modaresi. In the Zainabiyya shrine was run by the Modaresi and Shirazi clans, who oppose Khamenei and Khomeini for generations now. So Iran cannot really count on the Arab Shia as they want, but they have one only successful example now too, and that was Hezbollah, for a total different reason. But the Hezbollah, strong as it is, does not represent all the Shia of Lebanon. We still have Amal, we still have different groups, and Iran knows about that. But they benefit perfectly from the fact that in the Arab media, Shiites and Iranians are equally called. If you talk to Iraqi Shiites from other regions than the south of Iran, in the south of Baghdad or of Basra or so, they would refer to the Iranian Shiites as brothers when they are Arabs, the Khuzestani. But when it comes to central Iran, where the Persian or the Azeri element is, this is simply different, mentality-wise, even cultural-wise, because they are Arab and the others are simply not. So Iran has not, this is not a foregone conclusion. This is why the Iranians pay a lot of attention what is published in the West, how to present Shiaism in the West, and they of course try to benefit from the prejudice which says that all the Shiites are Iranians. Now, there were two visions the Iranians had, and as all revolutionary regimes, revolutionary belief that the same thing as happened to them applies to the region. And the strange thing is that part of this vision, elements of this vision we could hear today in a different context. The core vision is that all these dictatorial regimes, like Egypt under Mubarak and so on, have a big cleavage between westernized elites, many of them who don't even speak properly the local language, but because they have educated in French and English schools, they are much more in their worldview Western-oriented and have no connection to the ordinary population. And they will either leave because of democratization by the ballot or by the bullet because of revolution. So the Iranians have a cultural approach, not a Marxist approach towards their revolution. They say this revolution in Iran was not about food or people being poor, it was about culture and dignity. And they saw this in the Arab Spring. There might be a misinterpretation, but the important point is that they were very puzzled about the way the Arab Spring worked. And then they had to make a decision which turned out fatally Less so for them, but it was also bad for them, but for the Syrian people. Because if you take this Iranian analysis that you have dictatorial regimes and the people, which is more Muslim in culture, will kick them away, then you would have already an explanation of what has happened in Syria. So they needed a Hokme Hokamati, a leadership order, to say no, Syria was only foreign terrorists, and beyond that we should keep on the Syrian regime. And there was a fierce debate which was in between the revolutionary guards, the think tanks and so on, where many think tankers said, please, the Syrian regime is gone. Nobody likes the Assad gang. Why should we stick with them until the end? Now, there were two reasons. One was Khamenei realized too late what was going on. And the second point was the Iranians tried too late and with too weak means to talk to the Ikhwan, to the Muslim Brotherhood of Syria and to the Syrian opposition. So they passed an opportunity and thus stuck with Assad. So they knew that this was wrong. Propaganda says something else, but they stuck with it. Taking this as a starting point, all the other conflicts were then rearranged according to Syria. And all the vision that once upon a time the pro-Western regimes will fall, the secular regimes will fall, and then it will be a Muslim community and Muslims will rule everywhere, and the West will have no role to play, and Muslims can define the destinies of their countries on their own. This chance was simply gone because meanwhile, due to events in Afghanistan, in Iraq and so on, the sectarian factor went totally out of control on both sides, on the Saudi side and on the Iranian side. Both had mismanaged this sectarian factor catastrophe. Now, how do the Iranians think they can continue? As far as I realized, and as we can judge, the most important point for them is to come out from Syria with some kind of dignity intact. They have tremendous losses. They do not run out volunteers, but these volunteers are mostly not volunteers. But there is a realization coming from two groups. One is the Rouhani government, and the second one is the army. Because the army, for the first time in their history, had to deploy special forces outside of Iran and so on, because the Revolutionary Guards messed it up tremendously. So both say, how much of this is still Iranian national interest? And they reformulated Syria as, if we don't fight Daesh there, we will fight them in Iran. However, they don't fight Daesh too much, although they say so. They fight the other Syrian opposition. But this prediction became true because now we have Sunni Iranians fighting in several Sunni militias, and Shiite Iranians or Afghans fighting on the other side. And therefore, Iran is stuck in Syria, importing automatically the whole mess of Syria and of Afghanistan into its own country. And this is what Iran's biggest concern is. Add to this the Kurdish issue, the complicated question of the PKK, and so on. Now, the Iranians, therefore, would like to come out, but it's a little bit like the game of Mikado. The first one who moves is the loser. So they hope, by clinging on and sticking on Syria, that the Saudis would make the first move. So to make this more easy, acceptable for the South, they toned down their own propaganda, but I don't think that it can work. What could be done is, though, to accept the fact that there are three powers now who have to replace what the Russians and the Americans cannot fix. These three powers are all heavily invested in Syria for different reasons with totally different and complicated dynamics. These are Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Unless there is no understanding in these three countries about how to stabilize Syria from a local Muslim perspective, because you have to live with Sunnis and Shias alike, you have to live with Kurds, Turks, Arabs alike, the next 1,000 years. Unless this is achieved, any attempt from outside will be futile. Because it is these three countries who drive agendas, and at least they have the capacity to destroy any other designs. And perhaps the only chance of Syria is that with refocusing not only resources on Syria, but intellectually to accept that this is the Muslim challenge of the century. Unless this is done, and the initiative is coordinated in the region, no one in the West will be able to impose anything upon the region. But it could become something like a Palestinian-Israeli conflict with not only 5 but 10 million Syrians living in refugee camps for generations to come. Thank you.